Sure. So centering prayer is wordless, silent prayer. So most people think of talking to God, and I'm not, by all means, I'm not suggesting stop any verbal prayer that you do, and I still pray verbally. But centering prayer is sitting with God, wordless, sitting with God, and letting and going beyond our thoughts and emotions, and letting God act in us at a deeper level beyond our words, our thoughts, our emotions, and let us really connect to our true self, the person God wants us to be. So that's really what centering prayer is. And I can quickly explain how you do it because people probably are wondering
Yeah,
what
yeah,
the heck,
let's do it.
what is
I'm
this?
curious.
So centering prayer has been around for 50 years. It was created actually by three Trappist monks in the early 1970s. So three Catholic priests saw
All
other forms
right.
of meditation going on in the secular world, and they wanted something for the Christian community. And one of the priests, Father William Meninger, was reading a 14th century classic book called The Cloud of Unknowing. And as he read it, kind of the method of silent, wordless prayer jumped off the pages at him, and he began practicing it amongst himself, the other priests, and then they began rolling it out to the public. And then about 10 years later, in 1984, the Contemplative Outreach Organization was created, and it's contemplativeoutreach.org. And it has a ton, it's the main centering prayer organization with a ton of centering prayer resources and groups that practice internationally as well as in the US. So I just wanted people to understand this practice has been around about 50 years, but the idea of silence goes all the way back to Jesus and earlier. I mean, Jesus went off to be alone by himself, and we surmise he wasn't always just talking. He was just sitting with God and communing with God and resting in the rest of God. He wasn't always talking, particularly if he was fasting. He couldn't. He needed to conserve his energy, so he was sitting with God and letting God acting him and letting God nourish his soul, so that when he left the desert, he could go on his missions and do the things he was called to do by God. So that's a little bit about centering prayer. Looked like you were going to say something before I was going to describe how you do it.
I did. Well, I was just processing, like, especially in this community, there are so many people who are aspiring speakers, they're podcasters, they're teachers, they're coaches. And so we are often finding ourselves talking. Right. We're often the one who is presenting and has the mic. And just this morning, I was in a different chapter to a book about Abba Father, and it literally by Brennan Manning is his name. I'm not sure if you've heard of it or not, but he was
I have.
talking about the powerful element of going on these 8-day retreats. I don't know why he chose 8 days. You would think he would choose 7, but he would go on these 8-day retreats once per year where he would have to remain in silence the entire time. No reading, no out loud prayer, no TV, no music, no worship music, and just truly sit in silence. And I was processing it thinking, God, that kind of sounds terrible, a little bit frightening. I don't know where my mind or my spirit would wander in that moment, but it makes me think of The Shack, the book The Shack, and
Right.
how he went on this exploration essentially in his mind, in silence because he fell, but it was a dream that ended up putting them on this entire revelation of healing. And I think that's the word that I keep coming back to when I think about centering prayer. I just think of the healing of being in silence and being able to hear from God in a way that we're not generally attuned to.
No, I mean, you're exactly right. Centering prayer, I've been practicing it since 2014. June, I don't know what's magical about June. Well, I discovered centering prayer in the fourth quarter of 2013. I was looking on Amazon for a book to read, and I came across Amos Smith's book, Healing the Divide, Recovering Christianity's Mystic Roots. And in his book, he talked about a practice called centering prayer, silent, wordless prayer that he had been doing for 15 years or so up until that point. And that immediately intrigued me because silence always intrigued me. I just didn't know what to do in this silence. And I would just sit in silence for minutes at a time. And it was brutal. And I thought, I'm going to persist and see what happens. But when I
Totally.
discovered this practice, then I had a tool for sitting with, how do you sit with God? So centering prayer was a practice that really resonated well with me. And I decided to take it very seriously, began practicing it twice a day for 20 minutes each, as much as possible. And I don't know what's so magical about June 2014, other than I guess I was just ready. And I haven't looked back. It's resonated with me, and it really has changed me. And it's not centering prayer has changed me, it's God has changed me. Because when you sit with God and just let go of you and let God act in you and get yourself out of the way, God heals you and God transforms you. Should I quickly just tell people how you do
Yeah.
centering prayer? Because
Yeah, I
people
want to
wonder, well, how do
hear.
you,
And
how
I
do you,
still have so many questions. I want to know, like, beyond just how to do it, because I want our listeners to know how to do that. I want to know, like, what are some of the revelations that you've had during that time? Or has there ever been like audible voice, or just like a sense of knowing? Or how is he speaking to you in that time?
Sure. And let's get into all that. But how you do centering prayers, you sit comfortably with your eyes closed. And let me also explain centering prayer. People will say, is it just meditation? And yes, it is, but it's more than that. It's meditation, but it's also building a relationship with God in a different way, where you're sitting with God and you're not just talking to God, where you're learning to sit and listen to God. Is what it is. So centering, you sit comfortably with your eyes closed to begin your centering prayer time. You interiorly introduce a sacred word of usually one or two or three syllables. So it could be ocean, God, Jesus, love. And that signifies you're sitting with God, and the purpose of your sit of opening to the presence and actions of God within. We don't think we're God, but we know God is within us, waiting to come out and take action in the world. So you sit comfortably, close your eyes, use your sacred word to begin your sit. And then as you're sitting there, as you begin engaging your thoughts, and what I mean by that is if you begin thinking about all the things you did before your sit, or you begin thinking about the errands or duties or responsibilities you have to do later that day, you realize I'm no longer sitting with God. I'm sitting with me. I'm sitting with my routines, my planning, my plotting. You reintroduce that sacred word to come back to the purpose of your sit, of sitting with God and letting go of your engaged thoughts and just sitting with God and trusting God. And you just use the sacred word when needed to keep coming back to the present moment and purpose of your sit of returning to God, returning to God, returning to God. So it's not used as a mantra, and there are practices that use a mantra in centering prayer. It's just used when needed, and it doesn't have to be a word. Some people will use a word if they're more audible people. I quickly discovered I'm more of a visual person, so I interiorly picture a Jesus icon actually in my head to come back to the present moment because I'm more visual. Some people are more physical; they'll use their breath to come back. And then lastly, some people are afraid they'll fall asleep if they close their eyes. So they keep their eyes open and stare at a spot 5 feet or so in the distance. So
Yeah,
that's essentially how
I'm like thinking about like where I would do it. I'm immediately
during
like, ooh, I
prayers
want to
just to
try.
continue with God during this.
Rich, we must have some lag time. There we go. I can see you a bit better. I was thinking about where I would do it, right? And the process of I couldn't lay down because I would fall asleep. I'd want to do it outside, but I feel like nature, even though nature to me, there's an essence obviously of God because he made it. If I would get distracted by a bird or like where would my attention end up diverting? And so I think that the element of closing my eyes and actually having that visual image, I'm much a visual learner myself, that would be really powerful.